In this video, I will be showing you around the campsites I stayed at when I was in Gladstone and what it was like when the lights went off. So join me on this episode of Murky Sebs Wild Underwater Adventures. There's all these tiny swallows flying around and they've made a nest right up here, you can tell, because, well, there's all this bird dirt all over the toilet blocks, but if you look up there, you can see their little nest. I think I can hear a frog. See if we can see him. Well, the frogs are hiding in these little hollow metal areas. And I can't see into them, but they're definitely in there because you can hear them. See if I can get a light down there. Can you see him? Nice little frog in there. He's a bit hard to see. On the first day, I saw these amazing little birds. I didn't get the best footage of them because they were quite far away and I couldn't get closer to get a good look at them. But I'm so happy I got to see these little birds. They're a type of pale-headed Rosella, which are found in northern Australia through Queensland into northern New South Wales. And they love to eat grass and tree seeds as well as berries, just like we see here. These beautiful little birds are having a feast on the seeds and grasses growing alongside this campsite. And when it comes time for them to find a nest, these brilliant little birds find a hollow tree trunk, typically 1 meter deep, but it can be all the way up to 30 meters deep, which is enormous, especially when you're such a tiny little bird. They typically lay between 5 and 9 shiny white eggs once a year. After having a good look at the pale-headed Rosellas, the sun eventually went down and I went to have a look around the campsite to see what I could find. There's a whole different type of species out here at night time. We're going to see what creatures we can come across around the campsite. We've already seen a bunch of frogs. We'll see what else we can manage to find. Usually get a lot of different creatures out here at night time. You wouldn't normally see during the day. How perfectly does that little guy blend in with his environment? You can barely tell he's there between the leaf litter. He's almost the same colour as the dried grass. Here's quite a small native species of frog. I'm not entirely sure which one it is because there are so many species of native frogs and they all look quite similar. Maybe someone who's an expert in frogs can point out which ones we're looking at, but I was just happy to see them. They were such a joy to find, and I had to be really careful with where I was stepping because, as you can see, they blend in so well with the surrounding area. What a beautiful little frog. He's so small and hard to see and camouflages perfectly with his surrounding environment. We heard him last night and we finally managed to find some of them just hiding down in the grass here. They're really beautiful looking frogs. Hopefully I got a good look at them on my camera. After having a look around my campsite, I went down to the nearby river, which was mostly dried up, but there were a few patches of water where there were some lilies growing, and there was so many different species of plants. And in one of the trees, looking up at the tree, I saw this amazing little frog. It was a light brown colour, looked very polite, and kind of a chunky body with a small head, and those big black eyes. I'm not entirely sure of the species because, as I've said, there are so many species of brown tree frogs that all look very similar. And on the ground, here was another species that also looked very polite, had a chunky body and big brown eyes and a nice big smile. Everywhere I looked, I was finding these frogs. Despite how well camouflaged they were, they seemed to be everywhere. I guess there was a lot of food for them here, and it being close to the river, that's the perfect spot for them to spawn. And then they come up to the campsite for some food and to hang out, I guess. This looks like a striped brown frog, perhaps a striped marsh frog. I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps if someone's an expert in frogs, they can let me know. And then on the trees, there were lots of ants crawling around and some very well camouflaged geckos. I probably missed a few of them because of how well they blended in with the trees. But look at this one. Just waiting there patiently for some food to come along, and then it's gonna strike. And with all the ants crawling up and down this tree, that gecko is in the perfect spot for a feast. But he's gonna have to watch out because there were some very big ants crawling up and down this tree as well. This ant would have probably been a third, if not half the size of that gecko. This area was just so full of life. On that same tree, there were loads of these ants, possibly gathering sap, possibly trying to make a nest. I'm not entirely sure what they were doing, but they got very disturbed when I got close to them to try and investigate, so I didn't want to disturb them anymore, so I just left them be. And then right by my tent was this awesome species of ornate burrowing frog. And I do know a little bit about ornate burrowing frogs. They're quite sort of rotund and stubby, as they're described. They're a small species. They don't get much bigger than about 5 centimeters. And they come in a lot of different varieties. Some of them are very, have a lot of patterns on them and are very colorful. This one isn't particularly colorful, but it does have an awesome striped going down its back and some awesome patterns going along its body. And their distribution is all the way from down in Sydney up through Queensland into northern Australia, almost reaching into Western Australia. As their name suggests, they like to burrow. They burrow feet first into the ground, scraping the soil out behind them, and they're usually only seen after heavy rainfall. And I guess it had rained recently, so that's why I was lucky enough to see this one. These were one of my favourite species of frogs, along with the pobblebonk. And seeing this one right next to my tent made me really happy. They just have such a cute aesthetic to them. You know, they're like quite small and round, and they have the big eyes and a big mouth. And really little hands and little back feet. It was so awesome to see this one. And after a few days at this campsite, it was time to move on to the next campgrounds. And we stayed in these cabins which were very small, and they'd be okay if you were by yourself, but I was sharing it with 4 other people, so it was quite unpleasant in there. And as you can hear the noise I had to put up with at night time, I didn't really get much sleep. It was quite unbearable. So I decided to go out at night and have a look at what was around this area. And in the darkness, I could hear the scream of the lovely curlew. And there are a few curlews around this campsite, so I went around and I had a look. and they're quite hard to see in the dark. When you get near the curlews, they tend to stand still. Their defense mechanism is to just try and blend into the background. And once again, I found another species of gecko on one of these trees. They had an awesome striped speckled pattern going down their back. They camouflaged very well with this tree. But although I was really close to them, their defense mechanism was just to stay as still as possible and hope that I didn't see them, even though I didn't mean them any harm. They don't know that. So it's best to keep your distance from little creatures like this. I imagine it's pretty freaky for them. And we decided to go for a drive at night down to the beach and have a look at what was going on down on the sand. As you can see, it was pretty spooky driving down this like really narrow dirt road. There was no one else around, and there was no lights or anything really. Just these tall grasses and the light from our headlights. And one of the first things I saw as I stepped out of the car was this pretty interesting looking spider just hanging out in their web. I'm lucky I saw it because it was quite a large spider and I did not want to walk into this web. You can see they'd collected a bunch of leaves and stuff and made quite an elaborate structure, which they turned into a nest, I guess. Somewhere to protect themselves from the wind and the rain. And when we headed down to the beach, unfortunately one of the torches had a weird hertz rate that the camera didn't like, so it made it flicker a bit. But there were so many crabs on this beach, and it was awesome seeing them all scurrying along the sand at night time. Everywhere I looked seemed to be full of life that you wouldn't normally see unless you stopped and had a look on the ground to see what was going on. There was a cuttlefish bone that had washed up on the beach. Some of them looked like they'd been eaten by possibly crabs or birds. Something was taking advantage of all that calcium laying about on the beach. Here was a spiky ball of grass. And these types of grasses grow on the beach, and I guess their seeds are in these balls that then get pushed along by the wind and deposit somewhere along the beach for the grass to start growing again. And after walking around, having a look on the ground and seeing what was going on, I decided to look up and see what was happening in the trees. Which was even more interesting because there were tree crabs. These crabs had made their homes hanging out on the branches of this tree. I'm not sure what they were doing up here, possibly looking for food. Maybe there were insects walking along that they'd like to snap up. Or, geckos and other creatures. It was really interesting seeing crabs in trees. It's not something you'd usually associate with crabs on the beach. They had beautiful purple backs to them. The camera didn't pick up quite well enough, but you can see their lovely big green eyes. They look just like bits of seaweed or kelp that you'd find along the beach. Perfect for blending in with their surrounding. And around the corner, there was a mangrove forest that led out into the sea. And so I decided to have a look around and see what was living in the water.
We've come down here at night time to try and find an unnamed species of blue eye that lives in the salt water and brackish water around this area. They're quite hard to find and there's very little information about them. All we know is that they're potentially in this area and we might be able to find some. So let's go have a look in the water and see if we can track down some of these unnamed blue eyes.
There was a species of fish I came here specifically to find called a saltwater blue eye. And blue eyes, as you know, we've seen on many adventures, and they live in brackish water, but these ones are said to live in pure salt water, or at least very salty water. And so we were looking through these mangroves trying to find them. Along the way, I saw a toadfish, and I saw a very large crab. But there were also lots of these little fish swimming around, and I thought maybe these are the blue eyes, but unfortunately they weren't. But I managed to get a good look at the crab from another angle, and this is a big mud crab. I managed to sneak up behind and see this awesome mud crab. This is quite a large one. They get a bit bigger than this, but this is probably an adult. It could be maybe 1 or 2 years old. They grow relatively quickly and live for, 3 to 5 years if they're lucky. They're really cool. When they're little, they tend to hang around the mangroves. When they get a bit bigger, they move out into the deeper water during high tide before moving back into the mangroves when the tide's low. They blend in so well between the mangroves. I was very lucky to see this one. They've got such beautiful blue claws. They have a particularly disgusting flavour as well. If you're given the opportunity, I would not recommend eating them. And here's a toadfish up nice and close. Some of the fish would let me get up nice and close with my camera, whereas others would speed away really quickly. But toadfish are really common along the coast of Queensland. And I always like seeing them. I actually think they're a really cool and interesting creature. And they can swell up to be quite a lot bigger when they feel threatened by inhaling water, or if they're outside of water, they inhale air and make themselves really big. They're kind of like a pufferfish in that respect, but they don't get quite as big as a pufferfish. And after having a look in the water, I decided to have a look just out of the water, where I saw some of these awesome creatures hanging out on the like mussels and snails that were living on the rocks. And these are called blennies. I've made a video about blennies in the past, which I will have linked somewhere on screen, which you can have a look at if you want to learn more about them. But they are amazing fish that live sort of in the water and sort of out of the water at the same time. They have very elaborate patterns across their body and really interesting colours. And with their eyes up high on their head, they're able to see any threats coming nearby them and dart back in the water. They look kind of like a mud skipper, but they tend to live on like rocks and in tide pools. And they have the ability to spend a decent amount of time out of water as well as in the water. They use their fins to climb about on the land, and they also sort of wriggle like a snake to move really quickly as well. There are lots of different sea snails living on these rocks, as well as species of mussels and limpets and barnacles and other sort of creatures that cling to the rocks. And there were mangroves popping up all over the place. Here's another blenny hiding in these rocks trying to keep safe. It's got a nice hiding spot there. They blend in perfectly with their surroundings. And that was the areas around Gladstone at night time. I hope you enjoyed seeing what life is like after dark in these areas. I've still got a few more videos left from this trip. So I'll catch you on the next one. Until then, keep it murky.